He collected 10,000 troops, drew a circle around them, told them to move, filled the circle up again. Now, it filled that circle up 170 times, so he knew that he had about 170,000 troops, so foot soldiers. Then 80,000 horses and about 20,000 men with chariots and camels, besides servants and camp followers and the crews of the 1,100 large warships and 3,000 smaller vessels and transports, besides all that other stuff. Altogether, it was the largest army ever raised by one country to make war against another. When Xerxes had inspected both the land forces and the fleet, they set out once more on their southward march. All the towns where they halted had been busy for months getting together provisions for these unbidden guests, and rivers that had to quench the thirst of this multitude were left with empty channels. There it is. Thus the army passed on its desolating track like a swarm of locusts, leaving ruin and famine behind, a track which the Thracians held it impious to cultivate, but left unplowed and unsown, as though sacred to Xerxes and his mighty host. At last this long march came to an end at Therma in Thrace, whence they could see across the water Mount Olympus, the home of the gods of Hellas, and the boundary of unconquered Greece. Here they must halt to learn whether the Greeks meant to fight or yield. Bring your big battleship to somebody's port, and then ask them how they feel. And that's what he's doing here. Bring his army right up to the border, then send the envoys over. Say, are you ready to capitulate? When the arrival of Xerxes at Sardis had been made known in Greece, it was clear that the peril of invasion was at hand. In this emergency, the only hope of safety lay in union. Sparta and Athens, at any rate, must stand together, for both had most grievously insulted the king by the way in which they had treated his heralds. Now it's said that the heralds who were sent to Sparta had been thrown into old marble quarries, and they were told you can find earth and water there. A congress was at once summoned at the Isthmus of Corinth to discuss the means of defending Greece. All the chief states sent envoys, except Argos and Thebes, for Argos was jealous of Sparta, we saw that earlier, and Thebes hated Athens. Both preferred to stand aside and see how things went before taking a decided part. The Congress passed 3 important resolutions. The first was to forget all private differences, make up their quarrels, at any rate for the duration of the war. Athens and Aegina led the way by agreeing to put an end to their old feud. The second was to send spies to Asia to find out all about the plans and preparations of the enemy. Accordingly, 3 men were sent to Sardis to discover what they could, but they fell into the hands of the Persians, who tortured them and would have put them to death had not Xerxes forbidden it. So instead of putting them to death, he takes them and shows them the army and all the camp and all the provisions. And then he sends them back to Greece and says, go tell them what we're bringing. The third resolution was to send to some of the larger colonies, such as Syracuse, Crete, and Corcyra, and bid them help the old country. This too was useless. All made different excuses, for they were too much afraid of the great king to provoke his anger on behalf of their friends. So none of their outbound colonies are going to help them very much. Sparta, as the leading state in Greece, was to have command of the armies. Before they returned to their homes, all the envoys took a solemn oath that should fortune send them the victory, they would make war on all Hellenes who had submitted of their own free will to Persia, and dedicate a tithe of their wealth to Apollo in his sanctuary at Delphi. So they said, if we win, everybody who has not joined in this Congress, after we get done with Xerxes, we're going to whoop their asses. While the Congress was yet sitting, messengers had arrived from Thessaly to ask for help in the defense of their country. The road from Macedonia to Thessaly passed over a narrow pass between Mount Olympus and Ossa, where the river Peneus followed on its seaward path. If once the Persians got possession of this pass, they could overrun the whole plain of Thessaly, and with their vast numbers trample the defenders underfoot. The Thessalians sent to ask the Congress for an army to help them hold this pass. We are ready, they said, to join in the defense, but you must send a considerable force. If you are not willing to do this, then understand that we shall submit to the Persians. All who heard of this thought the demand was just, and they resolved to send troops by sea. They sailed through the Euripus and marched northward into Thessaly. Here they took up their position in the Vale of Tempe, which is so narrow that a handful of men could hold it against a multitude. Unfortunately, they had forgotten two things. The Persians could get there by sea just as easily as the Greeks, and there was another path, quite passable in summer, though rough and difficult, over the mountain passes of Olympus. There was a risk, therefore, of being taken in the rear by the enemy and having their retreat cut off. Without even an attempt at defending the second pass, the army withdrew, this time to take its stand further south on more advantageous ground. The unfortunate Thessalians had no choice left but submission to Persia. So Thessaly they couldn't defend. Thermopylae, the pass, is what they have to fall back to. The Greeks had now to find a new line of defense. This time they looked for a place which could be held both by sea and land. So this time they hoped that the Persians won't be able to go around them. They found it at Thermopylae. Thessaly, through which the Persians were now marching unhindered, was a low, flat river valley surrounded on all sides by mountains. The southern exit led between mountains and a swamp which stretched to the sea. At two places the swamp and the mountains were so near together that there was not room for two chariots to pass one another. These places were known as the gates because there were hot springs here, and the hot gates, which in Greek is Thermopylae. Hot gates. At other points the pass was wider, but the Phocians had built a wall across it in the hope of keeping out their Thessalian neighbors. The sea here was only a narrow gulf, approached by still narrower straits between the north of Euboea and the mainland. Here were a narrow land pass and a narrow sea pass, which might be defended by a small army and a small fleet. The fleet went to Artemisium, on the northeast of Euboea, to keep the enemy from entering the strait. The army was posted in the narrowest part of the pass of Thermopylae. We know that bit. Though the whole of the Persian force was marching southward, it was a very small army that Leonidas, the Spartan king, led against them. The Peloponnesians thought that they could make a better stand at the isthmus, but that meant giving up all that lay to the north of it, and of course Athenians would not agree to this. Themistocles wasn't able to convince them, but they tried to build a little wall anyway. Now it says King Leonidas and the 7,000 men under his command at Thermopylae. Of them, only 300 were Spartans, we knew that, and they were hand-picked, very specially hand-picked, and the king's bodyguard, in which no one might serve if they had not left a son at home. If you're in the king's bodyguard, you have to have some way to keep your family from going extinct. They won't let you in the bodyguard unless you do. Quote, "The men who marched to Thermopylae did not expect to return. They went there because duty called them to lay down their lives for their country. The rest of the army was made up of Arcadians and other Peloponnesians, and some troops from central Greece. When Xerxes heard that the Greeks had taken their stand at Thermopylae, he sent out a spy who rode up to the wall behind which they were sheltered. At that time the advanced post was held by the Spartans. They had planted their shields on the ground behind the rampart and were amusing themselves with games and gymnastics, while some were combing and dressing their long hair, as they always did before a battle. It's basically the rites that you practice before you're going to die. You're not sure you're going to die, but you might. When this scene was described to Xerxes, he laughed and would hardly believe that men who act like this in the face of the enemy were foes worth dreading. If they're just doing gymnastics and combing their hair and playing games and stuff, we're just going to walk over these guys. He waited 4 days, thinking that they would surely withdraw as they had done from Tempe. At last, when he saw no sign of retreat, he sent forward some troops with orders to bring the Greeks into his presence alive. Go bring them to me. Great was his surprise when he found that the Greek spearmen could hold their own against the Persian archers. The pass was so narrow that there was hardly space for shooting, and the troops were soon engaged hand to hand. The Greeks were the better soldiers and had the more convenient weapons, but the overwhelming force of numbers was against them. For 2 days the fighting continued,